Hello, and welcome to another week of Read It First by Lisa Gray, a podcast dedicated to discussing a new book each week. This week, the discussion is over I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. Honestly, I saw the movie I Am Legend with Will Smith before I have ever even realized that it was a novel. The movie is considered to be based on the book, but as you'll note in the discussion, it's quite loosely based. The beginning of the movie starts with Dr. Robert Neville, who is going through downtown New York with a dog. He turns out to be currently in the military, to have an innate protection from the vampirism virus, and is a physician. As you'll note, some of these fall into line with the book, but you'll see during the discussion what parts don't. So there are 4 parts of the book. The first is focused in January of 1976. Then you go on to March of 1976. The third part is June of 1978. And the final part is January of 1979. So the book follows Robert Neville, who was previously in the military in Vietnam. While he was down there, he was bitten by a vampire bat and got very ill. So he's walking around his house on a cloudy day, taking note of any damage that has occurred the previous night. He comments that there's only one plank of wood over the window that was loose and needed to be replaced. Robert notes that he previously had used plywood, but the vampires would throw rocks, breaking his windows. I guess he didn't fully cover the windows with plywood, whereas the planks he did. It doesn't really state. He also has a hothouse in the back and a water tank that are protected by high fences and overhead nets to protect them from the rocks and bricks that the vampires throw. To protect the top of his house, he burned down both houses on either side of his so they couldn't jump over onto the roof. He also has a generator that he has protected in a detached garage with a station wagon, which is what he uses to travel around and collect everything he needs. The primary objective of Robert's life is to make a safe haven for himself and to make more stakes to kill the vampires. He figures somewhere out there has to be others like him, and the only way he can find them is to search for them, and he might as well kill some vampires while he's along the way. In the book, Robert is not a scientist or a physician. He's a simple man who just does what it takes to survive. He is also dependent on both cigarettes and booze. Throughout the book, you'll notice that he goes back and forth between drinking heavily to the point where he's completely just obliterated for days at a time, and not drinking at all, depending on what's happening. His primary workspace is in his bedroom, and he often notes that he needs to make a divider that separates his bed from the workbench, where he has a saw and a lathe to make the stakes. On cloudy days, Robert stays near his house so he wouldn't get caught away whenever sunset came and the vampires came out. He talks about that if he was smarter, he would be able to determine when the sun would set so he could go out even on these cloudy days. Then on days with dust storms, he would stay inside. He didn't like the dust getting everywhere, and it still unnerved him. Then, whenever there were sunny days, Robert would go out to do errands, which included obtaining more water, food, and doweling, and also staking resting vampires. Another errand that was done as necessary is to remove the corpses that were killed by other vampires and put them in the burn pit that was a drive away. It was dug out about 6 months previously in June of 1975. I guess that was about when everything got bad. It was determined that fire was the only thing known to kill the virus. He also notes that vampires would kill each other in order to survive, and they usually killed the women. One big note is that there is a separation of living and dead vampires, and honestly I would call them undead as they are still functioning. Pallor of the skin and lack of breathing are mostly how he tells apart the living versus the undead. The living vampires still breathe, and they still look pretty alive. Robert hypothesizes that the living vampires were more psychologically changed, while the dead ones were physically changed. But both were able to be killed in the same ways, with the exception that the dead ones often turned to dust when he staked them. He kills multiple vampires during his various day excursions, even talking about killing children ones, which, after that, he would go home and drink himself into a stupor. He had been a father before the whole virus took out both his wife and daughter. Later, Robert would think about an old coworker who worked with a mortician. They discussed that in the vacuumed, airless tombs, the dead would stay in the same appearance as they were whenever they were living, which I thought was kind of interesting. But as soon as air was let in, they would deteriorate, so much so that if the corpse was long dead, they would turn into dust that looked something akin to salt and pepper. One of the vampires that Robert ends up staking does this, which makes him think about this conversation. During the night, Neville usually stayed locked up in his house, listening to the vampires outside murmuring, snarling, and fighting amongst themselves. Occasionally he would hear a dog bark and have rocks or bricks tossed at his house. In the event that Robert looked out his front door's peephole, the women vampires would try to be erotic and try to convince him to come outside and leave the safety of his house. After years of being without another living soul, he admits that it was tempting and that he would often think about them during the night. I guess this is a part that you don't really think of in a post-apocalyptic universe, because usually you see multiple people living, so they usually have each other to talk to and have relations. Anyways, some of the times that he was listening, Robert thinks about the idea that he should soundproof the house, but he just keeps putting it off. He just plays music on a phonograph very loudly or ends up putting earplugs in so he can no longer hear them. One of the more obnoxious things that he tolerates is an old neighbor who became a vampire, Ben Corbin. Every night and every morning, and throughout the night, he would yell, "Come out, Neville!" I couldn't imagine having to live this way, to just have to go through the same thing over and over and over again, especially alone. But he does have chores that keep him focused. He listens to music and he even reads books. Plus, I think having been in the military might have given him some additional psychological resilience that allowed him to cope with this. Robert has determined throughout the months that mirrors don't really work to keep the vampires away, but garlic certainly does. So he grows garlic in his hothouse so that he can replace the strings of garlic around his house about twice a week. I find this interesting that that's about the only thing that really falls in line with Dracula. And the fun part is, Neville even reads Dracula in the book and quotes Van Helsing. The strength of the vampire is that no one will believe in him. Neville agrees darkly that that's true. No one had believed, which is why everyone kind of died. So most of the other aspects that are within Dracula don't really follow what the vampires are in I Am Legend. Robert comments at some point in the book that vampire dogs are likely where the myth of vampires being able to change into wolves originated. I believe in the second part is where he determines that vampires can indeed cross running water, as he saw whenever he put a hose out and had running water in his front yard, and Ben Corbin just kept running back and forth, jumping over it, just to kind of be like, haha, see, this doesn't work. Even though it's been quite some time since the virus hit, Robert still has hope that there's other living humans out there. And Robert starts to kind of go down a little wormhole of how were these vampires formed, considering everyone thinks that it was a virus, but no vaccines, no medications seem to help. Robert recalls a dust storm that happened before his wife and daughter became ill. His little girl, Kathy, apparently dies first. They don't really go into detail about it, which is probably a good thing because it's always hard hearing about how children die. But it goes into him watching his wife, Virginia, die. He even notes the very first morning when Virginia is ill and tells her that, oh, she should rest, and he'll make sure that Kathy gets to school. Virginia questions if Kathy should go to school considering the virus. Should she be around all these other kids? But Robert insisted that, the schools would end up getting closed if it was bad enough. This kind of makes me relate back to COVID. Obviously, COVID is not like the vampire virus, but we did experience a huge outbreak, the pandemic, that ended up shutting everything down, or nearly everything down. I find this kind of interesting, considering Richard Matheson wrote the book in the 2000s, and it was published in late 2007. So the COVID pandemic wasn't there. The SARS pandemic had happened, though. The amount of death and disease spreading was something that really no one had really thought that heavy about, with the exception of different infectious disease specialists and epidemiologists. I mean, COVID is the first global pandemic that we've experienced, but I think that's probably due to how travel was changed. Hopefully the next pandemic won't be as deadly, but I kind of see it as it's Mother Nature's way of cleansing herself to help decrease the threat of global warming. The one big positive is, though, that thanks to the SARS vaccine and the COVID vaccine, we're able to really work on the mRNA vaccines to get everything out quicker. But we also have the fear of antibiotic resistance, as many of the antibiotics that we're using, we are kind of getting immune to. That's just a big part of people taking antibiotics whenever they have a virus and not a bacteria. And also people not finishing their antibiotics. Sorry if you're one of those who don't, but this is just legitimate information that you will learn in any immunology class. Anyways, back to the book. So Robert has multiple points where he thinks about killing himself. That's understandable. I mean, he's been completely alone. He's trying to cope with all of this, and at points he's just kind of like, why does it matter? What am I fighting for? But his survival instinct wins out. When Robert is hungover, he decides that even though it's overcast, and he didn't wake up until 10 a.m. when he normally wakes up at 5 a.m., he just couldn't stand to stay in his house another minute. So he leaves in his car and doesn't even think about closing his garage door because he figures, oh, he'll be back before nightfall. He drives aimlessly and recklessly, going 65, 70, 80 miles an hour, going only about 6 miles to the cemetery where he had ended up finally burying his wife, Virginia. Initially, whenever she had died, he'd buried her in a field next to the house, even though at that point it was mandated to burn all the dead. His daughter, Kathy, had been burned. Virginia returned home after she had been buried, and Robert had to actually kill her. So again, he probably went into a drunken stupor after that, which is understandable. He had watched his wife die, and then he had to kill her again. So after the second death, he puts her body into a crypt, which this is where he ends up going. He goes to the cemetery, and he finds this crypt door open. He's furious, thinking that if they had touched her body, he would burn the whole city down. He also had the thought that he wishes Kathy could have been placed there with her mother. Luckily, he simply finds a living vampire and Virginia's body completely non-disrupted. He drags the male out of the crypt and tosses him into the sun. He doesn't pay attention to the vampire. He just goes back into the crypt, kind of just wallows in his misery and loneliness. When he finally decides to leave the crypt, he closes the door carefully and almost falls over the man, which he realizes is very, very dead. The man smells and looks like he's been dead for days. He's like, sunlight is a way to kill them. I don't have to think about staking them anymore. It's a lot of work. It's hard to find the dowling. And he realizes how stupid he has been, that he should have realized this sooner. They only come out at night. Why wouldn't they come out the day if the day didn't do harm to them? So he kind of goes down a tailspin of ideas. So does sunlight only work on the dead vampire, or the undead vampire as this man was, or will it also kill the living vampires? Why does sunlight kill them? Why does garlic work? Maybe it has to do all with the blood. So Robert sets to find a living vampire. He drags her into the sunlight and leaves her body. Then he starts to think, oh, is she really dead? Or did she just look dead and she'll just come back? So he looks at his watch. He's like, it's only 3 p.m. Got plenty of time to go grab her and get back home. So he drives back to the house where he had left her body. And he looks down at his watch and realizes, oh shit, it still says 3 p.m. And it dawns on him, he didn't wind his watch. He's like, will I be able to get home before night? Why was I so stupid for not checking this? Why did I leave the garage door open? They can potentially destroy my generator. So he utterly tailspun, which is understandable. So Robert shoves the female into the back of his vehicle and takes off in the station wagon to get back to his house. As he's getting near, he starts seeing vampires start coming out. He really miscalculated his time. He's panicking. And he's like, you know what? I just need to get home. I don't want to die. So he accelerates. He's hitting them. As they're all in front of his house, he's like, I need to get them away from the house so I can get in. So he tries to take some of them out with the vehicle. He knows that probably won't work. But if he can at least get them to chase the vehicle, maybe if he rounds the block and comes back, he might have a chance of getting inside before they get all on him. But he knows if he does this, he'll have to leave the car in the street and not be able to get in the garage, close the garage door, and get back in the house. So he knows that this is a sacrifice. So he stops the vehicle. He dives out, and Ben Cortman suddenly comes out of nowhere, tackles Neville. Neville uses Cortman's long hair to bang his head against the side of the station wagon and goes to run to the house. And he realizes, my keys are still in my car. So he runs back to the car, fights a few vampires as he's trying to get away from them, grabs the keys, get onto the porch, fights a couple more vampires, and finally manages to get inside. But as he's trying to close the door, one of the vampire's arms are in the door, so he has to break the arm, shove it out, and quickly close the door. The sad part is he wasn't able to take care of the garage, so he knows that they're going to destroy the generator. So he's wandering around the house, and suddenly he hears this noise, and he looks at his people, and he realizes they've flipped the station wagon. So he gets angry. The lights aren't working. They've just destroyed his station wagon. They probably destroyed his generator. He doesn't have another working vehicle. How the hell is he going to get his supplies? So he goes outside with his shotgun, shooting several of the vampires. When he finally runs out of ammo, he starts bludgeoning the vampires until they take away his gun. Then he starts beating them with his hands and feet. When he finally gets his shoulder slashed open by one of the vampires, he kind of wakes out of his berserker state, and he goes back into the house. We jump forward a few months where Robert has repaired the house, on the inside and the outside, repairing the holes that he had made, repairing the generator, driving to go get a new station wagon, as that is the only vehicle that he knows how to repair. And he soundproofed his house. He also replaced the washing machine that they had destroyed, cleaned up the garage, and he notes that during this time where he's got all this focus, he doesn't touch alcohol. He's got so much going on that it's kind of just something he enjoys to drink at the end of the day instead of something that he relies on to survive. So now is where we're actually go back into learning about his life with Virginia and a little bit about Kathy. They discuss about how the virus was spread, what's going to happen, was it secondary to the war that they had just won, and did it mean that they didn't actually win the war? So a little bit while goes past and we jump back into Robert's life. And he starts trying to figure out what about garlic deters the vampires. And he's researching and reads that, the main component of garlic is also found within leeks, onions, shallots, and cloves. He kind of berates himself on this because he's like, if I would have done this sooner, I might not have had to go find all this dang garlic. So he tries at night to see if onions will work. He puts them out on a piece of wood in his front yard, and the next morning they're all destroyed. So obviously, onions don't work. He determines that the primary component of garlic that could be the point in repelling the vampires is allyl sulfide and isothiocyanate. He figures out how to create those compounds, and 4 hours later, he has a syringe full of the components and goes to inject a vampire. Nothing happens. So he starts to try other things. He takes in a female vampire and puts a cross in front of her. She freaks out. He puts a hand on her shoulder to try to get her to look at it, and she bites him. So he ends up hitting her, I'm guessing killing her because it mentions throwing the body outside of the door. And then he uses alcohol to clean his hand. Then he questions, is the cross all that they're worried about, or is it because of their faith? So Ben Cortman was Jewish. He tried to see if the cross would work on him, but it didn't. But when he brought out the Torah, that did it. So he determined at that point that more than likely the cross was what they determined to be the factor that kept them away, because Christianity was the predominant religion in Europe. If all of this had taken place elsewhere, it could have been the Torah or any other number of religious symbols. So finally during the day, Neville hears a dog barking, and he realizes if he's hearing this during the day, the dog can't be a vampire. So he goes to go outside, scares the dog away. He's like, well, crap. So he goes to put out milk and hamburger. The dog comes several times throughout the week to get the hamburger and milk, and whenever Robert leaves it and the dog doesn't get it for a couple of days, Robert worries about the dog. So he kind of goes searching throughout the neighborhood, being like, where is this dog? Can't find him. The dog eventually comes back and is limping, and Robert's concerned that the dog got attacked. So he's finally made it up to the point where the dog allows him to be kind of within arm's reach. So as the dog is really weak, he grabs the snout so that it can't bite him, and takes the dog inside. He keeps taking care of the dog until it finally dies. And then he buries it and continues on. He tries hunting down Ben Cortman and is never able to find him, even though he knows that he has to be somewhere in the neighborhood. He's always the first one there, so how else would he not be? So months later, Ben is being searched for, and Robert sees this redheaded woman crossing a field. It's in broad daylight, so he's like, she can't be infected, right? So he goes and starts to run after her, and he's yelling at her, and she panics. I mean, you're talking about a 6'3" man, over 200 pounds, that's bulk muscle and boots, and that has a beard. He's gotta be terrifying looking. So he ends up finally tackling her and dragging her back to his house. Once she's inside, he starts to kind of go, the dog was infected, but he was still out during the day. Is she potentially infected? So he locked her into his room and went and mashed up garlic. When he went back into the room and woke her up, well, first off, he found that she was wearing a gold cross. She was really hard to wake up. It's like, okay, the cross seems like a pretty good sign that she's okay. She wakes up and he tries to put the plate of garlic under her nose. It makes her violently ill. And this makes him wonder if she is infected, because that is what it does whenever what he had determined as a bacteria, because he ended up getting a microscope and taking some of the blood of the vampires, and he found that it was a bacilli, which is a rod-shaped bacteria. So he already knew more there than anyone else. He's tried multiple antibiotics to try to kill it, but nothing worked. So he's like, okay, the only way that I can determine if this woman is legitimately infected or not is to test her blood. So they'd finally gotten on speaking terms, and he's like, I need to test your blood. That's how I'm going to know. She's like, I'd rather wait for the morning. So morning finally comes around. He tests her blood, and as he's trying to look in the microscope, she bashes him on the head. She takes off, and he finally comes to and goes, what the hell just happened? Like, his head is spinning. She probably gave him a concussion. And she left a note for him that basically summarized that she was a spy. She is infected, but she's one of the many that are taking a pill that keeps the virus or the bacteria from multiplying within them. So they're able to control everything. They're able to go out and date. They're able to eat. And she begs him to leave because she understands that everything he did wasn't out of anger or just to kill, but because he was doing it to survive. And she begs him to go up into the mountains to run away because everyone that's like her is going to come and hunt him down. They're going to want to exterminate him like he had exterminated so many of them. Robert goes back and forth thinking about it and decides not to. So the end of the novel, he is watching at night when suddenly all of these vehicles show up with these men. And they kill a bunch of the vampires, including Ben Cortman, which Neville even states that he's sad about this. That Neville felt that Cortman deserved a better death than that. And he had kind of grown attached to watching all of Cortman's antics. He knows that they're coming for him too. They don't try to knock, they just start destroying the front door and the back door. And they end up getting in. He shoots at them. He doesn't really try to aim, but it's kind of, I'm trying to protect myself here. So at the very end, they have knocked him out. They have taken him. And he's like, well, I guess I do get some sort of something. But they took him just to kill him. But the woman, Rue, that he had taken care of, comes and sees him and states, well, I'm a high-ranking official, which is why I can see you, but take these pills. They're going to kill you. And the last thing of the book is him being let out to be killed, and he just states that I am legend. So it kind of was a ramp up that you just went off the ramp and it's just like, okay. You don't really get to see what type of civilization they've made for themselves. He refuses to become one of them. You have no idea what pills she gave him. But in the condition he was in, she knew he couldn't get away. She wished that he would have, and he just was like, if this is it, this is it. Take some time, go back and read it yourself. If you have any comments on things that I've missed or on discussion points that you think would be interesting to talk about, put it in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe. That way you'd never miss another episode. and thank you so much for listening this week. Next week, we will be discussing Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies by Jane Austen and Seth Grahame-Smith. Here's a little synopsis. Complete with romance, heartbreak, sword fights, cannibalism, and thousands of rotting corpses, Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies is an audacious retelling of English literature's most enduring novel. This expanded edition of the beloved Jane Austen novel, featuring all new scenes of bone-crunching zombie mayhem, begins with a mysterious plague that falls upon the quiet English village of Meryton, and the dead are returning to life. Feisty heroine Elizabeth Bennet is determined to wipe out the zombie menace, but she's soon distracted by the arrival of the haughty and arrogant Mr. Darcy. What ensues is a delightful comedy of manners, with plenty of civilized sparring between the two young lovers, and even more violent sparring on the blood-soaked battlefield. It is the perfect read for literature lovers, zombie fans, and anyone who loves a reanimated Austen.